the past that, as I said during the little teaser, is not necessarily significant in and of itself, but it's wonderful to deconstruct because of what we'll be able to pull from it. So that's what we're going to do, and then we'll pivot to the present. But before we plunge in, let me introduce Grace, who is my partner in crime. This week, I'm honored to be working with Grace, and she will give you the instructions, if you need them, on how to weigh in with questions, because of course at the end there's always time for questions.
Well, good morning. It's wonderful to see you all. Thanks for letting me be here. I'm Grace Leatherman. I'm the Executive Director of the National Council for History Education. I'm always watching these on Thursdays, but I get to lead today. Matt is running an online course for us with a lot of wonderful teachers in Kentucky. We do a lot of stuff here at NCHE. So Joanne, thank you again, as always, for doing this. It's really important for us as historians, but also as citizens and participants in society. So we're delighted that you're here. For everybody, we know you'll have wonderful questions for Joanne. If you could put those in the Q&A section, that would be great. I'll be sorting through those. And this is a history show, and it's also a family-friendly show, so do just keep those in mind. Keep your questions and chats fairly historical. That would be wonderful. And we do just want to say, if you enjoy this programming, and we know a lot of you out there are committed history educators, do join us for other programming at NCHE or join us as a member. You can join at www.nche.net. We have a lot of other wonderful programs. We're even probably tomorrow or Tuesday, we'll be announcing a summit on race, ethnicity, and history. We're very excited about that. We're going to be having a lot of programming throughout the summer. So do just stick with us here at NCHE. We think we have a lot of exciting conversations to have with you. So
education,
history education, yes. So I think I'm going to make this live on Facebook. And Joanne, do you mind if I hand it over to you and spotlight you?
Oh, go right ahead.
Great.
Okay, so we're going to plunge in. As I said a moment ago, today's topic is protest. I picked a protest from 1795, as I mentioned a moment ago, not because it's a highly significant protest, but because there's a document associated with it that I love, and because just the event itself is really evocative of some of the issues at the time with protest. So that's what we're going to be pulling apart. So let me offer you a little bit about the background of the event, and then I'll walk us through it. What I posted as our document for this week is actually a newspaper account of the event, and the title of this week's discussion, which has the words Hissings, Coughings, and Hootings in it, comes from, as you'll see if you can make out that newspaper article, the newspaper article itself. So quickly, the background. So first of all, throughout the 1790s, the United States is always being tossed back and forth between France and Great Britain, right? One makes a friendly gesture, the other gets upset. The United States makes up with the other one, and then the first one gets upset. So, and there are superpowers, and we are not. So that's constantly tricky for the United States throughout this period. So now we are at one of those moments. 1794, there is a treaty made, the Jay Treaty, gets to the United States in 1795. And there had been problems with trade and Britain and America and a number of other things as well. The Jay Treaty was an attempt to reconcile that, but the fact of the matter was the United States didn't have a lot of leverage, and for one and another reason, this treaty ends up seeming to many people too soft on England. Now that sounds like, you know, wow, how controversial. We're too soft on England. But everything is politicized in this moment. And as I always teach in my classes, the domestic and the foreign affairs are not two separate realms in this period. They're bound together because the assumption is whatever happens in foreign countries and how foreign countries interact with the United States is going to fundamentally shape what the United States is. So this is part of that politicized foreign affairs moment. But also the Federalists are the alliance or the party that are England friendly. The Republicans, the Jeffersonian Republicans, are the folks that are France friendly. This is part of that as well. There are some objections that the treaty is not only too easy on England, but that it doesn't protect American commerce enough. So at any rate, there are a lot of people who are not thrilled with the treaty. It gets, I was thinking about this morning, so timely. It gets leaked to the newspapers. So the public gets to read it. And so what you have, and I think the newspaper, I don't have it in front of me, but the newspaper article describes how, I think there was a meeting of Federalists, I think it says merchants, but that tells you a lot about who a lot of the Federalists were, who are upset about what's going on, and they decide they want to address the public, and they put out some kind of a handbill saying that they want to talk about it, and one thing leads to another, and you end up on a Saturday at noon with this protest taking place in front of Federal Hall. Now, I'll say at the outset, I offered you one newspaper when I first wrote about this, and it's actually the first page of content in my first book, Affairs of Honor, because it's so revealing. But when I was reconstructing it for that use, the fact of the matter was I had to use multiple newspapers and search in private correspondence, because the newspapers, the Federalist and Republican newspapers, did not, you would not know that was the same incident, right? One of them is like, there were thousands of people, and another one says, a couple hundred, maybe, if that. So, you know, that probably sounds familiar as well, that the side that wants it to be big makes it big, and the side that wants it to be small makes it small. So you're getting one side of the account in this newspaper, but it's more complicated. So anyway, crowd of people, maybe 100 or two, maybe 1,000, I don't know. But they're there and they want to protest the treaty. And Hamilton apparently was on the stoop of Federal Hall, waited until noon when this protest was to begin, and then steps up and begins to address the crowd, because of course that's what he would do. I want to hold forth on the Jay Treaty. And he tries to talk to the crowd. And first of all, interesting thing number one, the crowd basically asserts its right by saying, we're not against hearing from you, but let's make this a debate, and we'll elect a chairman from the audience and someone to represent the other side, and we'll stage a debate. Now think to yourself the modern image of any kind of protest, and you're not normally electing chairman and staging a debate. So that already tells you that we need to think about what the word protest means. It's a word that has a modern meaning that in this period, as I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, the idea of popular protest is hedged in and kind of hazy. So at any rate, there's a big crowd, they're upset, they want to have a debate. This does not work so well. No one can hear anything. Hamilton finally loses patience with that and then begins to try and address the crowd, but he is drowned out with, my favorite phrase, hissings, coughings, and hootings. So descriptive. So he then, I think, tries to separate the crowd, like everyone who wants to hear from me, come over here, and everyone who doesn't, stay over there, which no one really does anything about. I think he thought that people did that, they didn't. He tries to address the crowd again, this does not go well. Apparently, and I hadn't noticed this until rereading the document today, he showed up with a resolution to offer the crowd, right? To read to the crowd. I thought in my mind when I talked about this incident, I thought that he stood up and announced this, but no, he penned a resolution. Actually, perhaps Rufus King penned the resolution, but what the resolution basically says to the crowd of people who are upset is, actually, I think I have the quote here. It is unnecessary to give an opinion on a treaty. He says to the crowd, what your opinion doesn't matter here. This is a treaty. You don't have to. It is unnecessary to give an opinion. Why are we even here? Okay, so that in and of itself is an amazing statement about a lot of things I'll come back to in a moment, but the crowd is not thrilled with that statement. They become angry. It's not in the newspaper article, but I found it in private letters when I was reconstructing the incident. Some people began to throw rocks at Hamilton, they're like, yeah, okay, enough. What do you mean we're not allowed to have an opinion? They throw rocks, and then Hamilton and the 3 or 4 Federalists who are up on the stoop of Federal Hall with him, I think Hamilton says something like, friends of order, follow me. And they all leave in a little cluster. And I will say that later that day, so then after this event, there are people standing in the streets arguing about this. And Hamilton walking down the street, and I think all wound up and angry that he was sort of dishonored in that way, and what he wanted to happen didn't happen. He gets in 2 fights on the street, not fist fights, but in one case he does wave his fist in the air and say, I'll fight the whole detestable faction of you one by one. and someone steps up and says, okay, like a Republican, okay, name your terms, name your weapons. So he gets involved in 2 duels right after that Jay Treaty demonstration, because he feels humiliated, because he feels the need to defend himself, because there's all this anger in the street. Okay, so that's the incident, but let's deconstruct it a little bit. First of all, as I said before, the crowd has its sense of order. The crowd clearly has a sense of its rights. What's interesting about this moment, and what's happening in the 1790s generally, but the late 1790s particularly, you know, we think of the United States as being democratic, small d. We don't always think about what that means. I think we're in a moment where we're thinking about what that means. In the 1790s, people were debating, one of the big differences between Federalists and Republicans was the fact that the Federalists were uncomfortable with popular protest in the streets. They basically thought, and this is going to be a vast overstatement, people should vote in elections and then step out of the way and let their betters rule. And if they don't like what they do, they can vote them out of office at the next election. So the people are governing, but protests in the streets, not necessarily a wonderful thing. The Republicans are much more comfortable with that kind of popular protest. Of course, at this moment, there's the party that does not have power. So there's a little bit of that dynamic too, but still the Republican Party generally much more comfortable with protest, with what we now would call democracy, democratic modes of expressing public opinion. So part of what we're looking at in this moment is Federalists saying, we don't like this. We don't like this, this shouldn't be happening, and why is it happening anyway? Because your opinion of a treaty doesn't matter. And the crowd saying, yeah, it does. What we think matters. And we might allow you to talk, but now that you've started talking and we don't like it, we're going to shut you down because we have that right. So the late 1790s is partly a really interesting experimental moment when people with power and the American public with a different kind of power are feeling out the boundaries of democracy and figuring out how much of a voice the people can and should have, and how much control should government have over that kind of process. The American people register part of an answer to that question, right, with the election of 1800. And the election of 1800 sees the Federalist Party booted out of national power and the Republican Party put in its place. Part of that election, part of what that means is that the nation is turning in a different direction from how Hamilton might want it to be directed. And when you read his correspondence after that election, you can see that he thinks the nation's going in a direction that he doesn't want it to go. And in part, that direction involves more popular protest, more popular engagement to a degree that he felt would be not secure. So part of what you're looking at is a debate with protest over what kinds of rights the public has. What you're also seeing is an important fact that I think has relevance today, and that is it's malleable. You know, people have different definitions of protest and safety, and sometimes those definitions are politicized in some ways. Sometimes people just have conflicting ideas about them. I was very wary about taking on this topic this morning because there are so many ways in which people on different sides can come down hard on this and insist on things that have more to do with their point of view than with the general idea. So one of the things I want to say now, and I'll say it again, is my point here, one of the points I'm making, and that's what this semi-demonstration in 1795 shows so well, is that what we're talking about here is something that has soft edges that needs to be negotiated. And that's what we see in 1795. And I think that's an ongoing process. I think democracy is an ongoing process. I think, as I'm going to come back to say in a minute, you can't take things for granted. It's an ongoing process. And we're looking at it in 1795. Switch my pages here. Obviously, we are in a moment where whether people are aware that we're debating that or not, that's once again what we're talking about. We're talking about the right of protest. We're experiencing protest. We're looking at different kinds of protest. We're looking at kinds of response to protest. And people are having very dramatically different responses to that. I want to say a few things. And I want to say first what I think that crowd in 1795 was well aware of. And that is the right of protest is fundamentally important. Fundamentally important. And I want to point you for a moment to the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights. Think about what's in the First Amendment. It's the free press, the right to petition and peaceable assembly, or the right to protest. What do those three things have in common? They are all ways in which the American people can hold the government accountable. You can write in the press what you think about the government. You can petition the government to demand things that you think are right. You can peaceably assemble and protest for what you want. That's why those three things are together in that amendment, is that they together add up to one of the absolute most fundamental aspects of democratic governance, and that is the accountability of the government to the American people. That's at the core. That's what all of that is about. And, you know, I think even yesterday I was off on Twitter pontificating about accountability, and someone said, oh, it's like an empty platitude. No, no, it isn't. And I think so many foundational principles, because we're used to the words, we forget the meaning. And accountability matters. And if a government is entirely unaccountable to the American people, it is not a democratic government. I mean, I'm just going to lay it right out there. We're at a moment where we are really reckoning with what accountability means in government. And a part of that reckoning process is protest. And there are all kinds of lines that we can draw about violent and unviolent and safe and not safe. I mean, I'm not going to go into those levels of detail because that's part of the debate, the ongoing debate about protest itself. But I am here to say, even in the first 5-6 years of the government, the American people realized how important that right was. The people in power understood that it was important and were trying to assert themselves, and it didn't go really well. I think another lesson to draw from that incident and from the current moment is that because it's so fundamentally important to who we are as a nation, if you're going to act against protesters, you should do so carefully, you should do so with thoughtfulness, you should do so thinking of the rights and ideas of the people protesting. Instant escalation and force sends a message to the American people that protest is dangerous and bad. That is a bad message. That is a message that suggests, sorry, you don't get to protest against things you don't like. So, as I'm saying this, I'm imagining all the many things that people can say, fist waving at me. But the fundamental things that I'm saying here, that protest is vital, it's a fundamental right. It needs to be protected and thought about. It needs to be handled with care on the part of the government. All of those things, I think, are pretty fundamentally true. Switch the page here. See what else I have. I'm going to read a quote. I debated whether I was going to read this quote. And I'm going to read it, and you'll hear why I debated, because there are all kinds of contradictions bound in with what I'm saying. And then actually, before I open things up, I do want to talk about the word civility. But Hamilton, in Federalist number 8, writes about freedom and security. And among the things he says, he talks about how during insecure times, well, here, I'll read it. It's a couple sentences. The violent destruction of life and property incident to war, the continual effort and alarm attendant on a state of continual danger, will compel nations the most attached to liberty to resort for repose and security to institutions which have a tendency to destroy their civil and political rights. To be more safe, they at length become willing to run the risk of being less free. That's the balance. And that's a delicate balance, and it's a significant balance, and it's one that we need to think about. Before I stop talking here, one last thing, and that's the word civility. That word is another one of these words that I think people assume it has one meaning, and I don't think it does. And I also don't think all protests can be lumped under, like, are you being civil? And an example of that, when people first began to talk about civility, I thought to myself, okay, is refusing to sit at the back of the bus civil? A lot of people would say that wasn't civil at the time, right? Was that a valuable thing to do? Yes. Did it do harm to anybody? No. So I don't think civility is the measure always that we need to be going by. I'm not saying that I approve of violence, which I don't necessarily. I'm not saying anything, no value judgment, but I am saying, think about words and concepts. Think about words like protest. Think about words like civility. Think about rights. Think about all these fundamental things that we all take for granted, and I think have taken for granted for a long time. And be aware of the fact that in this moment, when all of these things matter so fundamentally, we need to be thinking about them, and we need to be acting in support of what we feel are fundamental rights, not by turning against each other as Americans, but by being aware of what we're doing, not assuming. Remember when we all started History Matters, the first thing I talked about was contingency. And I said, we can't assume it's all going to be wonderful because we're the United States and it's always wonderful. And we can't assume we're going downhill and we're circling the drain. That's not necessarily true either. We don't know what's going to happen. We are in a supremely contingent moment. All moments are contingent, but this one really is unpredictable in many ways. And particularly in those kinds of moments, I think you have to be thoughtful, and I think you have to be active while you're being thoughtful. And I guess that's what I'm promoting here. And that's what I'm reminding people of, that they have a right to protest, and that it's tied to accountability, and the accountability of the government to the American people is a fundamental part of our political process. Okay, now I will stop. I will open things up for questions. I think I got everything I wanted to say. Okay. Oh, actually, I do this every week. I forget the mug.
Yes, show us the mug.
Every week, I swear. You know, when I teach, I forget Thomas Jefferson's birthday every year. I got my PhD at UVA. Every year I forget. And every week I forget the mug. Okay. So I didn't have a protest mug, but what I did have was a St. Croix mug. Hamilton. St. Croix. So we were talking about Hamilton. We quoted Hamilton from the Federalist. This is as close as I could come, but I am rather proud of myself because people on St. Croix gave me this mug. It has value. It has value. So anyway, that's this week's winner for the mug. Okay, now I will stop and open things up.
Thank you. I think this is a very important conversation, and it's so interesting just to consider it from the historical perspective and what Hamilton thought. So thank you. I'm excited. Again, if you would put your questions for Joanne in the Q&A box, that would be wonderful. We do have a few there. And I'm also seeing some interesting comments in the chat too. Thank you, everybody. Yeah, someone said, just to put it in context, Mozart had only died 4 years before. So sometimes that is interesting. What's going on in the rest of the world? It's interesting to ponder that context. So thank you for that.
Well, right, it's true. I mean, you know, another one of those phrases we toss around without thinking is age of revolutions. Mm-hmm. Right? Things are happening all over the world. This isn't just the United States. And we don't, you know, people don't think about that. Anything associated with the founding, there's like a big of course sign that people post above it. And we need to strip away the of courses, because we need to be thinking about all of those things.
So we do have a question from Gloria that I think is always relevant. How do you distinguish between a riot and a protest in history?
Right. Well, now we're getting into the realm of words and line drawing, right? So first of all, I think we need to think carefully about words. That's really easy for me to say sitting happily with you here on a Thursday morning. But if you're using a word like riot, there's baggage attached to that word. So if people are using it, you know, if you think back to the many weeks we've been doing this together, one of the continuing themes that I've brought up is think about the rhetoric, think about the words, think about what people uttering them or printing them might want you to think. And this is another one of those cases. I'm not going to be able to say, oh, here's the clear line between a riot and a protest. But what I can say is if someone calls something a riot, pause and think about what that means. What does that suggest? There are all kinds of things that can suggest, depending on who utters it and where it's uttered and the meaning, the context. But don't take for granted that something that someone calls a riot is a riot. Think about the ways that people are presenting what's going on. That's a continuing history matters and so does coffee message. And this is a great example of that. And we've seen it, you know, we're watching this on a daily basis. Different sides in a highly politicized argument using all kinds of rhetoric, in some cases to get people riled up, in other cases to get people riled up in a different way. It's a moment when we're looking at rhetoric swimming around, and some of it is dangerous rhetoric, and some of it I think is rhetoric that capitalizes on the fact that, for example, people forget their fundamental right to protest, which is why I chose to do this week. So there is no clean line, you know. If I sat here and said a riot is when damage is done to property, what's damage? And under different circumstances with different awareness, people would say, well, you know, if there's some property damage, you know, call in the law, don't call in the military. Well, now we're having an issue. We're in a moment where we're questioning structures of law enforcement too. So this is a supremely complicated moment. But my larger message here is, and I see someone talking about Watts riots versus Watts uprising. It's a precise example of what I'm talking about here. Think about the rhetoric because the words matter, and people who use specific words more often than not are doing so with an intention in mind and with a message in mind. And a lot of those words, and riot is one of them, sort of, there's an emotional response you have to that word and a lot of baggage and assumptions that go along with it. So before you plunge in, pause and think about the context of who's saying it and why. That's so important in so many ways with so many things now, which is part of why I say it over and over and over again on Thursday mornings, but I think this is another example of that.
And I think the fascinating thing is that that's true historically and in terms of current events, and that when we're, as history educators, when we're teaching our students the skills of analyzing secondary sources and primary sources, those skills carry over, and that we need to be considering language in both historic and modern contexts. So I thank you. That's very interesting, that distinction.
And right. Actually, and a great point to pull from that is I'm talking about the 1790s and I'm talking about now, but the fact of the matter is I'm talking about a debate, an ongoing debate, right? And that has taken different turns throughout American history for one reason or another, you know, in one way or another, sometimes moving in one direction, sometimes moving in another. So what we're looking at now has deep roots, and it's not as though there's a gap and this suddenly wasn't important. Right, the word thug is another one of those words. Who's uttering thug? Who are they claiming as a thug? What's the baggage? What's the cultural baggage that goes along with that word? And thus, what is this person intending us to think? Just be aware of language and rhetoric and the politics of rhetoric.
And we have a question, again, that I think it works in any period of time. Have people always seen conspiracy in government actions?
Well, and as a matter of fact, what I might talk about next week, and my thought this morning was conspiracy theories, that I might talk about that next week. I just have to decide if I can find a document that bemuses me enough. But that very well might be what I talk about next week. I shouldn't have given that away, but I think that's what I'm going to talk about next week.
So yeah, so conspiracy has a long history.
Oh, oh. Oh, yeah.
Conspiracy and theories about conspiracy.
Yeah. Now it says in the article, it says that Mr. B. Brockholst Livingston represented that they had already made up their minds upon it. Right. Right. Well, so what he's saying is, and that this is really interesting, right? That the treaty is leaked to the American public, and they've read it. And so when Hamilton said, "Let me explain it to you," Brockholst Livingston is like, "No, I read it. Like, I have my thoughts. Thank you very much. I don't need you to weigh in here, Mr. High and Mighty Federalist." So yeah, you know, in that case, I don't know if it's so much a Fox News, MSNBC equivalent. It really was just a printing of the treaty, but this was highly, highly politicized time. Federalists and Republicans, conspiracy theories, extreme polarization, threats of violence, all of these things are going on in the late 1790s. So on some level, yeah, someone sees the treaty, they already have very strong feelings about their politics, and they're basically saying, Brockholst Livingston, I don't need you to tell me anything. I know what I think, and I read the treaty, and now I know what I think of the treaty. So yeah, you know, it also tells you something about the dynamics during these kinds of really fraught, hyper-polarized times.
We've got all kinds of great questions here. I want to get to everybody. Let's see. Okay, so we have one from Ben. And Ben wants to know, so if Hamilton and Federalists if they're somewhat uncomfortable with some of these popular protests, Hamilton seems pretty uncomfortable. How did they view protests before the war, like the Boston Tea Party, or perhaps less physical protests?
Right. And this is, to me, a really interesting connection. Part of what discomfits people like Hamilton and the Federalist-minded people, they lived through the Revolution and saw the power of protest, right? The Revolution overturned one of the mightiest empires on the face of the earth, with Americans essentially beginning with protest and moving into war. This is a generation of people that understands that power. And that's precisely for that reason that someone like Hamilton, who is definitely more about law and order than some others might be, someone like Hamilton is thinking, well, we know what happens when people protest, like governments get overturned, right? So now we have a government, and it was a government that was debated, and it was, you know, debated in the states, and then it was ratified, and now it's in power. So we're not trying to overturn the government now. So protest is dangerous. That's an extreme view, and there is a reason why the Federalists are ultimately voted out of power. But yeah, that's precisely some of what's going on here, is that the Revolution is a great example of organized protest working. It's part of why what we now call political parties, it's part of why organized partisanship is scary to people in this period. Think about committees of correspondence and all of the organizations during the Revolution that Americans put together and then used to overturn, to rebel against and win independence from the British. What we now call political parties look a lot like those organizations, right? So the Revolution won a lot of things, was an amazing accomplishment to Americans, and taught them things that different people came away with different lessons. You know, others saw the power of protest and came away and thought, you know, I have rights in this government. Like I helped win this revolution, and I have fundamental rights, and I'm not going to give them up easily. So you can see, you know, we don't normally think about the Hamilton half. It's like, wait a minute, that revolution worked really well. Let's stop it now.
Stop.
but that's murmuring, you know, among Federalists as well.
And so Francesca wants to know, in light of that, in the First Amendment, is the right to assemble, is that somewhat controversial? When we're looking at the Bill of Rights, are people worried about,
well, it's the
specifically
right,
some of these things?
It's the right to peaceably assemble, right? I mean, so it's and assemble is a general enough word that it doesn't only mean big crowd of angry people. So I think, as I kind of suggested a little while ago, I think the idea that people should have the right to, in writing, protest against things that they think are unfair, should have the right to petition the government. Think back to the Revolution. Some of what was happening there was that Americans were petitioning to Parliament or the King and their petitions were being ignored, that's a problem. And the right of assembly, the right of protest. Again, revolution teaches some powerful lessons. I think that that was intended to be broadly defined. I don't think, I mean, a lot of people did not think there needed to be a Bill of Rights, right? I mean, some people thought, Hamilton thought, even Madison, that, well, whatever the rights are in the Constitution are given to this new government, and if they're not there, the government doesn't have those rights. So why are we doing a Bill of Rights? And this is the one argument that the anti-federalists won, which is, no, we really want a Bill of Rights, and some states have bills of rights, and we don't care if the Constitution is seemingly limited. We want a Bill of Rights, and that was one of the first things done in the first Congress. So I don't think there's necessarily discomfort. I think there's a wary desire to protect rights.
Great. And once again, everyone, we're just delighted to be talking to Joanne Freeman. If anyone's just joining us on Facebook, we do have some folks there. Do feel free to, if you're in the webinar, put your questions in the Q&A, and I will hop over to Facebook and see if there are any questions there too. But Christy wants to know if you can talk a bit about how views of protest at the time, if and whether that led to the military response to the Whiskey Rebellion.
That's a good example. Ooh, excellent. Yeah, so there's an example, the Whiskey Rebellion. There's a protest against an excise tax on whiskey. It's actually not an enormous protest, but it is a protest against an act of government. And Hamilton, and this should not be surprising given what we talked about today, thinks that that kind of protest against a measure of government needs to be crushed, right? In his mind, I'm going to get the phrase wrong. He thinks that someday the government will be powerful, but right now it isn't. I think he uses the phrase Hercules in a cradle or something like that. At any rate, he, as precedent and as a demonstration of the fact that that kind of protest against a measure of government won't be acceptable, he wants to take military action against it. That's his immediate thought. Let's march an army on them, which is what happens. And precisely that impulse on his part, that's dangerous, and that represents people discarding the authority of the Constitution, and the Constitution doesn't have much authority to begin with. We just created it, and there's not a lot of precedent, and it relies right now entirely, he would be saying at the time, it relies on the willingness of the people to abide by it, right? That's another word and an idea that we take for granted, Constitution, as though once it's enforced, it's capital C, Constitution, which it isn't necessarily. It's supposed to, I mean, people want it to be that kind of a document that has a different kind of status and importance and permanence. It's also something that was created a couple of years ago, and people are still figuring out how it works. So yeah, Hamilton and the Federalists responded to what they thought were threats against the law and order and the authority of rules and the government and the Constitution by military force. And of course, what he learns, he's acting Secretary of War at the time. So he's out there with the army marching on the Whiskey Rebels. He's actually kind of thrilled with the fact that he gets to march with troops on the Whiskey Rebels. There's a letter he writes to Angelica Schuyler Church, his sister-in-law, and it says something like, I'm going to get the language wrong. I am just now about to set out to conquer the wicked insurgents of the West. And he means that he's trying to be cute, because then he talks about like being a knight in shining armor and blah, blah, blah. But he did not have qualms about what he was doing. Ultimately, this is not an enormous protest against the government, and it's way over response, which gets back to some of the points I was making before the question period, which is rights of protest need to be addressed carefully, and call in the army is not the best immediate response.
Interesting. And we just have more history educators talking about things we teach in our classes. Let's see, so sorry, I just want to make sure I get the name. Who was asking that? oh, it's on Facebook. We do have a question from Facebook about whether or not Shays Rebellion was considered a riot at the time.
Well, so Shays Rebellion earlier takes place before the Constitutional Convention, not that long before it. So Shays Rebellion in Massachusetts, it's called a rebellion. The people who wanted there to be a stronger national government, so the folks who are pushing for what ends up being the Constitutional Convention, and Hamilton is one, George Washington is one, they look at that event and say, what's going on there? Like, people are protesting, they're shutting down courts, they're, and there's no way to stop them. The national government has no force. What can we do? We can't stop it. And, the Congress, the Confederation Congress sort of turns to the states like, hey, help. And the Confederation, the states are like, eh. So, it's a moment when for the people who become Federalists, the folks who really want a stronger national government, to them, kind of along the lines of what we're talking about here, yeah, they see that as a dangerous precedent being set, a great example of why there needs to be a stronger government. And they use that as one of the things that, an example of what's urging the need to strengthen the government. Not everyone agrees with that, but the Federalists definitely push that idea.
Thank you. And I think lots of us have taught Whiskey Rebellion and Shays Rebellion, so it's always good to get just a little more depth and context there.
Oh, thank you. Someone just said, before you go on to the next question, Hercules in the Cradle. Yes, I know that that's Max Edling's book, but I think it's Hamilton, and indeed, it is about the Whiskey Rebellion. I think he says something about we're Hercules, but we're Hercules in a cradle. I think it's a Hamilton letter to Washington.
Thank you all. And again, do continue if you have questions for Joanne, put them in the Q&A section. And we do have a question from Lori about the ideas of a candid world in the Declaration of Independence. Could you talk a little bit about how candor and civility are related to each other and to protest?
Wow.
That's interesting.
No, that is interesting. Candor. Well, there's a really interesting book. The first thing that pops into my head, it's a book that I read in grad school. I assigned sometimes in grad school. People tend to have a very mixed response to it because it's quirky. And it's called Declaring Independence by J. Fliegelman. And one of the things that book talks about is the importance of appearing honest and candid in this time period, the importance of seeming to be, straightforward and upfront, but of course, the contradiction inherent in that is that people are thus acting. They're putting on a performance to look really candid. So it's a moment when, and partly because of the Enlightenment and partly because there's a sense that there's, truths out there in the world that can be determined. Candor, I think, has a little bit of a political sensibility to it. But like everything else we're talking about this morning, even trying to look candid is kind of itself a performance. So candor is important in this period. And so that's significant, but I also think, boy, is that hedged in with a lot of meanings. As far as civility goes, in this time period, when they thought about the word civility, they would have thought about personal behavior, like rules of civility, like George Washington, as a young man, reads a book of rules of civility, don't cough at the table, don't interrupt people during conversation. They would have thought about civility as sort of personal decorum and behavior, not unrelated to some of the ways in which we use it today, but I don't think they necessarily would have absolutely linked those two things together, although they're obviously related.
Interesting. That's, I don't think we talk as much about candor.
I know, someone instantly links to Declaring Independence. It's a really quirky book. It influenced my first book. And if you read it, you'll see why, because it's like this culture of performance, which I think is a really good and important insight. It talks about performing the Declaration of Independence while you're reading it. But it's really quirky. It uses all kinds of weird forms of evidence. And some, when I've assigned it in the past, some grad students get really irritated at it, and that happened when I read it in grad school too. But it's definitely interesting and worth looking at.
Great. Let's see. We do have a thought. You talked about art last week, and the importance of art and the importance of art in protest and resistance. And so we do have just in the chat. You talked about the AIDS quilt as a modern example of art being used as.
Oh, that question.
Yeah. So
was the AIDS quilt a work of art, a protest, a petition, all of the above? Well, it definitely was a work of art and a protest, right? It was a work of art, and the fact its enormity was the statement that it was making, right? It was in and of itself, its existence and the size of it was in part a form of protest and a demand for attention and serious consideration and awareness. So in that sense, I'd say, you know, protest is one of those words that we need to think about the meaning of, but I think it was both of those things. Is it a petition? Well, in the sense that it is kind of making a demand on people in power to hear and consider a cause. I suppose you could say that it's a way to petition the government. I think obviously in this time period, when they thought about petition, they were really thinking about petitioning papers.
Right, it's a specific.
Yeah, and it, you know, that was a sort of almost sacred right that you could petition the government, and that was taken really seriously, and to a degree that we don't really fully understand now. So that, for example, during the debate over slavery, when the gag rule we talked about that on a Thursday morning too, when the gag rule is being discussed and it's silencing petitions, anti-slavery petitions, one of the ways in which John Quincy Adams gets Northerners into that fight, since they're not necessarily getting riled up about slavery, is that he emphasizes to them, you know what, your right of petition's being violated. You guys are petitioning Congress and we're not considering your petitions at all. That's serious. And Northerners take that as a serious offense, right? Slavery, they might not be so concerned about, but their personal rights and the right of petition, which I think we see as kind of antiquated, that's pretty fundamental.
So petition does have very specific historic meanings. So that's very interesting. Yeah. Let's see. And so again, if you have...
Wait, I had to stop for a minute.
Please.
A quote.
Yay.
Whenever the government appears in arms, it ought to appear like a Hercules and inspire respect by the display of strength. Well, we could talk about Hamilton and his views of what the government should be, but yeah, thank you very much. You guys, this is the thing about, like, this is why I'm so happy to see what you're saying. But the thing about this is that I'm here happily talking. You guys are at your computers. This happens in classes all the time.
They're Googling.
Googling. I know, when I'm in class sometimes and I'll say something, and it took me a while to get used to the fact that I would say something and then someone would pipe up and say, you know, I just saw, you know, and then suddenly we're talking about what's online. That adds a whole new level of teaching in a good way, but this is great. Oh, and look at that, the West Wing, the president talks about Washington's rules of civility and decent behavior in company.
This is, of course, a family show, but...
Well, don't spit, you know, don't spit. I mean, you can find that, it's online.
Yes.
It tells you a lot about gentility being refined in some ways in the 18th century.
Some really interesting studies on that.
One more question, and then we will go to the after party. Great,
that sounds wonderful. Well, I wondered, again, many of us are history educators. Some folks in the audience are teachers who will be going back into the classroom. Would you mind just talking for a moment about sources, places to find primary sources that one might share with students when thinking about these ideas?
Sure. And I guess I'd say a few things. And when you say these ideas, you mean protest?
Yeah. Or candor, or whatever. But just talk about where can we find some great primary sources that teachers can work with in the classroom?
Now, I will confess that my number one source of a lot of this stuff is a database that, you know, is available at Yale, and they pay for it. And I don't know how widely available it is out in the world, but the shorter answer is newspapers. The database I'm talking about is America's historical newspapers. And often when I want And that's actually where today's document comes from, right? Comes from that database. I knew I had to find Hissings, Coughings, and Hootings. So I went into the database and it didn't find Hissings, Coughings, and Hootings because of the weird S, but I found it through other means. At any rate, newspaper databases are great because ideally you can find an incident like this one. I could have done more research and found other newspaper accounts of it, and we could have talked about fake news and the problems of the reliability of the press and how it in a sense is always requires interpretation. But I realize that that's not something that's available to everybody. There is
most school systems, some school systems do have America's historic newspapers, and if not, I think all of you do have access to some historic databases, at least chronicling America.
I was say chronicling America. Yeah. Newspaper databases, one of the things that I sometimes ask students to do as an assignment in my undergraduate courses is to, a version of what I just said to you, pick an incident and then get to a Federalist newspaper and a Republican newspaper and see how they talk about it. And sometimes, like in the case of the protest that I talked about this morning, you would be hard pressed to figure out it's the same incident. Actually, in my most recent book, The Field of Blood, some of the fights I write about, one, like a Whig newspaper will describe it as like blood flowing everywhere, and a Democratic newspaper will say, yeah, he pulled out a knife but nothing happened. So again, I have to look at personal letters and look in diaries and do all of this reconstruction and triangulation to try and figure out, to the best of my ability, what really happened. But particularly now, going to those kinds of newspaper databases, finding the Jay Treaty or other things that people might have throughout time protested against, and think about this, in the 19th century, the 20th century, looking at really, really different accounts of those moments of protest, the words that people use, different ways that they're presented. That's a front and center way of showing students with a little bit of detachment how important it is to think about all of those things, how not to take things for granted just when they're thrown in your face, and that you really do need to think about the evidence that's presented in front of you. So that seems like a great assignment. But yeah, so America's historical newspapers and chronicling America. There are other places that have newspapers, other websites and such, but those are the two foremost ones, I think, that I tend to use.
Yes, and if your school doesn't have a database and you've already exhausted the resources of Chronicling America, which I don't think you could ever do actually, but most public libraries too can give you access to something like America's historical newspapers. So that can be a great thing, just to searching keywords or names, or you might present your students with two articles from differing perspectives, or set them loose and say, find different ways people used a certain keyword. So I think, yes, diving into historic newspapers with students is a very exciting thing to do, regardless of the age.
Although I will say, an important thing to think about, actually gets back to words, an important thing to think about when you're plunging into, particularly if you're going back in time, is that different words are being used to describe what you're looking for. So, if you're looking for Thomas Jefferson, you probably won't find him with his full name. You might find Mr. Jefferson. So you have to think about how they would use words. A great example of this was really early on, when there weren't so many databases. With my first book, there was an index, a digitized index from a newspaper. And I went to it and I looked up duel, and there was like nothing. And I thought, yeah, okay, that's not right. Like, why is there nothing under duel? And the index was according to the words that were in the newspaper. So I sat there and I rummaged, and ultimately I discovered the discussions of honor disputes and duels very often were headed by the phrase "a card," meaning like a posting.
Oh.
In 1,000 years, I would not have figured that out. I think I ultimately found an incident that I knew happened, and then I realized it was posted with a card, and then I searched on a card, and then I got all these other things. Anyway, it's a great example of the fact that you have to think about the words that people use at the time. So if you find one document, sometimes that document within it will tell you keywords and things that can help you find other documents.
Absolutely, that's great advice. And Tim Johnson says, also check out the Digital Public Library of America. So that is in the chat. So all kinds of, we're so lucky to live in a time when we can just have these newspapers at our fingertips.
Yeah. I know. Oh, the funky S. Someone says, how do you search? That's a problem. The search mechanisms do not always find the weird S. Like now, I looked for hissing, and it did not find hissing, even though you can see hissings, coughings, hootings. You know, I think you sometimes have to think of other words. Mm-hmm. You know, you search on that first, and if nothing comes up and you know it should be there, like I knew hissing was there. I thought coughing, hooting, Hamilton, J treaty. I did any number of other things. But yeah, that's a thing to consider, is that databases may seem really, you know, modern and up to date, but they are not taking into consideration all kinds of weirdness.
They're still going to require your thought and creativity, and your students' thought and creativity.
Part of the fun, right?
Research is fun. Well, I'm going to go ahead and, Joanne, I want to thank you so much for talking about the history of protest today and Hamilton's views on it. It's just really exciting stuff, and talking about the importance of these newspapers and primary sources. We are going to sign off. Again, I'm Grace Leatherman with the National Council for History Education, and I'm going to stop recording now, but we do hope you join us next Thursday.
Before you do, I do want to say, on my part too, as always, thank you guys for coming. Particularly, you know, I'm trying hard to find things to talk about that I think we need to be thinking about. This week is an example of that. So I hope I will see a lot of you in weeks to come, because I think what we're doing here is important.
Well, thank you all. And I'm going to go ahead and end the recording. If you'd like to just hang out and chat with Joanne, feel free to do that too. Just type in the chat box there, and she will be reading that.
Gloria, thank you.